Welcome to this deep dive into the hidden world of submarine cables.
Yeah.
You know those internet highways under the ocean?
Right, exactly. The ones that most people don't even think about, but they're so crucial to how the internet actually works.
Absolutely. And we're gonna explore that, but we're also gonna talk about how these cables play a role in geopolitics
That?
and digital sovereignty, which is kind of a hot topic these days.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area, and the research you provided for this deep dive is great.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. So,
Yeah.
it's amazing to think that over 99%
It's incredible.
of international internet traffic
Yeah.
travels through these cables. I mean,
Wow.
that's just mind-boggling.
It is, and you know what's even more mind-boggling is the sheer scale of this network.
Yeah.
We're talking about 1.4 million kilometers of cable,
Wow.
enough to circle the Earth over 35 times.
That's longer than the distance to the moon.
It really puts things into perspective.
Yeah, it does. So we're talking about a
Right.
massive infrastructure project here.
Huge. Yeah.
But what makes it so vulnerable?
Well, think about this for a second.
Okay.
One study estimated that a single day
Okay.
of global internet disruption could cost the world economy upwards of $40 billion.
Yeah, $40 billion.
Yeah,
That's a staggering number.
It is.
It really puts into perspective how much we rely on these things.
Absolutely.
But who's responsible for protecting these cables?
Well, that's where things get a little bit complicated.
Okay.
The responsibility is really fragmented,
Okay.
and the threats are both natural and man-made.
Oh, wow.
So you have everything from earthquakes
Okay.
and fishing trawlers to potential sabotage by state actors.
It sounds like a bit of a digital Wild West down there.
Kind of, yeah. It's a
There.
bit of a free-for-all.
So how does all of this
Yeah.
tie into this idea of digital sovereignty?
Right. So digital sovereignty is all about a nation's ability to control its own digital destiny. So it's about their data, their infrastructure, and their online services.
Okay.
Submarine cables are a key part of this
Okay.
because they determine which countries can access information and how quickly.
So if a country relies on cables owned or operated by another nation,
Yeah,
could that be a problem for their digital sovereignty?
absolutely. It creates a vulnerability, a kind of digital choke point.
A choke point.
Yeah, think of the Nord Stream pipeline situation,
Oh,
where Russia's control over the gas supply
Right.
had a huge impact on Europe.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how secure our own data is when it's traveling through these cables.
Right.
And could someone be listening in?
That's a very real concern.
Okay.
And it brings us to the issue of espionage and data interception.
Okay.
There's evidence that governments have been tapping into these cables for years.
That's unsettling. But how do they do it?
Yeah,
I mean, it sounds really complex.
it is. It's very sophisticated.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. Data travels through these cables as pulses of light. To intercept this data, you need specialized equipment
Uh-huh.
that can tap into the cable without disrupting the signal.
So it's not as easy as just cutting the cable
No.
or plugging in a listening device?
Not at all. It requires specialized underwater vehicles and highly skilled technicians.
Wow. So this is serious business.
It is.
Yeah.
But the technology exists,
Okay.
and it's been used for both intelligence gathering
Right.
and potential sabotage.
Okay. This is getting a little spooky.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the companies that are involved in all of this.
Okay.
I understand that tech giants like Google and Microsoft are increasingly investing in these cables.
They are.
Why is that?
Well, they're called hyperscalers.
Hyperscalers.
Yeah, and their motivations are complex.
Okay.
On the one hand, they need massive bandwidth to support their global operations, but there's also a strategic element.
So you mean it's not just about,
Right.
connecting people and sharing cat videos?
Exactly.
Some experts argue that these companies are engaging in what's called weaponized interdependence.
Weaponized interdependence.
Yeah, essentially they're using their control over this critical infrastructure to gain leverage over governments.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's take the example of Google's Equiano cable,
Okay.
which runs along the west coast of Africa.
Uh-huh.
It promised to bring faster internet and economic benefits to the region.
That sounds like a good thing.
On the surface, yes.
Okay.
But it also raises questions about what Google got in return for this investment. Was there pressure to adopt certain policies or regulations?
That's a really good question. It seems like there's a delicate balance between, the benefits of technological advancement
Yeah.
and the potential risks to national sovereignty.
Right.
But before we get into the solutions and strategies for
Yeah.
mitigating those risks, maybe we should take a closer look at some specific examples of cable vulnerabilities.
I agree. Looking at some real-world incidents will really drive home the need for proactive measures. So let's dive into some of those case studies and explore how these cables have been damaged or disrupted.
Okay. Are you ready for some undersea drama?
I think so.
Because some of these stories are pretty intense.
Oh, no, okay, let's hear it.
All right.
Okay.
Let's start with a seemingly harmless culprit.
Oh,
Fishing.
fishing.
Yeah, it might sound surprising, but fishing is a major cause of cable damage,
Really?
especially in shallower waters.
So we're not talking about, some James Bond villain cutting cables with lasers.
No,
We're talking about, like, a fisherman accidentally snagging a cable with his net.
exactly. Trawlers dragging their nets along the seabed
Oh, wow.
or anchors being dropped
Yeah.
can easily snag and damage these cables.
Okay.
And the repairs can be very costly and time-consuming.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, you think they'd bury those cables deep enough to avoid that kind of thing?
They do in deeper waters,
Okay.
but as the cables approach the coastline, they have to come closer to the surface,
Yeah.
and that makes them more vulnerable.
Makes sense. And then there's natural threats too, right?
Of course, earthquakes and underwater landslides can cause major damage.
So we've got nature and human error, but what about intentional damage?
Right.
Could someone deliberately sabotage these cables?
Absolutely.
Right.
And that's when things get even more serious.
Yeah.
One of the research papers you gave me talked about a 2008 incident in the Mediterranean Sea.
Oh, yeah.
3 submarine cables were cut in a short period,
Wow.
disrupting internet and phone service for millions across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia.
What caused that? Did they ever figure out if it was an accident or deliberate?
The exact cause was never definitively determined, but it really highlighted how vulnerable these cables are.
Yeah.
And it sparked a lot of concern about the possibility of sabotage
Sabotage
by individuals, terrorist groups, or even nation states.
So it's like a digital sword hanging over our heads?
In a way, yes,
But surely there are ways to protect these cables.
there are,
Okay.
but it's a constant cat and mouse game.
Oh, wow.
One approach is to increase physical protection, especially in those high-risk areas.
Uh-huh.
For example, some cables are now being armored with thicker sheathing, or they're buried deeper in the seabed.
That makes sense. What about using technology to monitor and
Yeah.
detect potential threats?
That's another area where we see a lot of advancements.
Okay.
Sensors and monitoring systems
Uh-huh.
can be deployed along the cable routes
Yeah.
to detect any unusual activity.
Okay.
Things like ships lingering in the area
Yeah.
or sudden changes in pressure or temperature.
So it's like a security system for the ocean floor.
Exactly.
But what happens if a cable is damaged,
Right?
despite all these precautions?
Yeah.
How long does it take to repair something like that?
It depends on the damage and the location.
Okay.
It can take weeks or even months
Wow.
to mobilize a repair vessel,
Oh.
locate the fault, and splice the cable back together.
That's a long time to be without internet.
It is.
I can't even imagine going a day without it.
I know, right?
Are there any new technologies that could speed up that repair process?
There are some interesting developments.
Huh.
One of the articles you sent me mentioned self-healing cables.
Self-healing cables?
Yeah.
What is that? That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It does, but it's becoming a reality.
Wow.
These cables use special materials and coatings that can automatically seal minor cuts or punctures.
So they fix themselves?
In a way,
Yes. That's incredible.
it is.
But technology can only take us so far.
Right.
What about the geopolitical challenges? We
Yeah.
talked about the role of hyperscalers
Yes.
and the potential for weaponized interdependence.
Right.
How can we make sure that no single country or company has too much control?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
It requires a multifaceted approach.
Okay.
One strategy is to diversify cable routes and ownership.
Okay.
If a country relies on a single cable
Yeah.
that passes through a potential adversary's waters,
Uh-huh.
that's a big risk.
Right. So spread the risk
Exactly.
by having multiple routes and multiple owners.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's where international cooperation becomes really important.
Yeah.
We need to work together to establish global norms and regulations that ensure the resilience and security of this infrastructure.
Makes sense. So are there any specific ideas being discussed?
There are. One idea is to create protection zones around cables in international waters.
Protection zones. So kind of like maritime protected areas.
Exactly.
But for cables.
Right. This would restrict certain activities in the vicinity of the cables.
Okay.
things like fishing or drilling,
Uh,
to reduce the risk of accidental damage.
I can see how that would help, but I also imagine it would be really difficult to enforce.
It would be. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah. What about countries that don't have the resources or the geographic location
Right.
to lay their own cables?
Yeah.
Are they just stuck relying on others?
Not necessarily.
No.
One promising avenue is the development of regional cable partnerships.
Okay.
So landlocked countries can team up with their coastal neighbors to co-invest in cable projects.
So they can share the costs and the benefits.
Exactly.
So it's about building alliances and finding creative solutions
Yes.
to overcome these geographical limitations.
Exactly.
Are there any other alternatives?
Well, another option is satellite internet.
Right.
It has some limitations in terms of latency and bandwidth, but it can be a viable option for remote areas or as a backup system.
Right. We've seen companies like SpaceX launching all these satellites to provide internet access from space.
Right.
But what about the countries themselves? What can they do to protect their digital sovereignty?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it leads us to this whole topic of data localization
Okay.
and the role of governments in shaping the digital landscape.
Okay.
Essentially comes down to finding a balance
Okay.
between harnessing the benefits of the internet while also mitigating the risks to national interests.
So it's a balancing act between openness and control.
You could say that.
And how that plays out will have major implications for the future of the internet.
Absolutely.
Will we see a more fragmented internet with each country or region creating its own walled garden?
Yeah.
Or will we find a way to maintain a global interconnected network while still respecting national sovereignty?
It's a big question.
Yeah. Those are some big questions.
They are.
And it seems like the answers will depend on a lot of factors.
Yeah.
Technology, geopolitics, economics.
It's all connected.
Yeah. But before we delve into the future of this underwater world, I'm curious about the impact on individual users.
Okay.
How does all of this affect our everyday lives?
That's an important question. Because ultimately, these cables are not just about data.
Right.
They're about people.
Yeah.
They connect us, they inform us, and they empower us.
Yeah.
And the way they're managed and protected will have a direct impact on our ability to access information, communicate with each other, and participate in the global economy.
So it's about more than just, getting our cat videos.
Much more.
It's about our freedom, our security, our way of life.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked about the vulnerabilities of these cables and the potential threats, but now let's talk about what we can do to protect them.
Okay, let's dive into that.
Okay.
So, it's interesting to think about how something as abstract as the internet actually relies on this vast network of physical cables hidden beneath the ocean.
It really highlights how interconnected our world is.
Right. And, as our reliance on the internet continues to grow, so too will the importance of these cables.
Right.
We've already seen how disruptions, whether they're accidental or intentional, can have huge economic and social consequences.
So what do you think the future holds for submarine cables?
Well, based on the research that you provided,
Yeah.
it seems pretty safe to say that we're going to see continued expansion of this infrastructure.
Okay, so more cables?
Yeah, the demand for bandwidth is only increasing. Things like cloud computing, streaming services, the Internet of Things.
All those devices.
Exactly. More and more devices connected, more data being generated.
Right.
And all that needs to be carried by these cables.
So more cables, but what about the technology itself?
Yeah.
Are we going to see any breakthroughs in cable technology?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are some very exciting developments happening in the field of fiber optics.
Okay.
Researchers are constantly pushing the limits of data transmission speeds.
So faster cables.
Essentially, yes.
But are there physical limitations?
Well, of course, there are physical limits to how much data you can cram into these cables.
Right.
But we're nowhere near reaching those limits yet.
Okay.
One of the papers you sent talked about a technique called space division multiplexing.
Space division multiplexing.
It's pretty amazing.
What is that?
So basically, it allows multiple signals to be transmitted through a single fiber optic strand.
Wait, so you can have multiple signals going through one strand?
Yeah, it's like having multiple lanes on a highway,
Wow.
all within a single cable.
That's incredible. So they're using light to transmit data.
Right. They use different wavelengths of light,
Okay.
each carrying a separate data stream, and then they combine those into a single beam.
That's mind-blowing. It seems like there's this constant race to innovate.
There is.
and push the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah, it's really remarkable.
But let's bring it back to geopolitics for a second.
Okay.
We talked about digital sovereignty and the concerns about certain countries or companies having too much control over this infrastructure.
Right.
How do you see all of that playing out in the future?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's something that's being debated at the highest levels of government and in international organizations. There's this growing recognition that these cables, they're not just commercial assets.
Right.
They're strategic assets.
So they're vital to national security.
Exactly.
And economic competitiveness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is leading to some changes in how countries are approaching this issue.
Such as?
Well, we're seeing a trend toward greater government involvement in cable projects.
Okay.
Some nations are opting to build their own cables, or they're investing in strategic partnerships to secure access to this infrastructure.
So a move toward greater control and self-reliance.
In some cases, yes.
But
there's also this realization that international cooperation is essential.
Right.
No single country can go it alone in this interconnected world.
We all need the internet.
We do. Okay. We need to work together to establish common standards.
Okay.
To ensure security and prevent the internet from becoming fragmented.
That makes sense. But what about the role of private companies, those hyperscalers we talked about earlier?
Right.
Are they going to continue to be major players in all of this?
Well, they're definitely well positioned to be.
Okay.
They have the resources, the expertise, and the global reach to invest in these massive projects. Right. But as governments become more assertive in regulating this space, we might see a shift towards more public-private partnerships.
Interesting.
Yeah, with governments playing a bigger role in setting the rules and ensuring that national interests are protected.
So it sounds like the future of submarine cables is going to be shaped by a lot of different factors.
It is.
Technological innovation, geopolitical competition, the need for international cooperation.
It's a complex landscape.
It is, and it sounds like it's going to be a fascinating area to watch as it all unfolds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing's for sure, though.
What's that?
These cables are going to continue to play a vital role in our lives.
Right.
Connecting us to each other and to the vast ocean of information that is the internet.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the technical intricacies of fiber optics to the geopolitical implications of digital sovereignty.
It's been a really interesting discussion.
It has. It's been a real eye-opening deep dive into a world that most people don't even know exists.
I agree.
So thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been my pleasure.
And we hope you've enjoyed this exploration of submarine cables, the hidden highways of the internet.
The internet's nervous system.
Exactly. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. It's really amazing to think that something as abstract as the internet relies on this massive network of physical cables, hidden under the ocean.
It is. It really highlights that connection between the physical and digital worlds.
It does. And, as we rely more and more on the internet, those cables are only going to become more important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've already seen how disruptions can have a big impact, whether it's an accident or something intentional.
So where do you see this going in the future? Are we going to see more of these cables? Fewer?
Well, based on everything we've looked at, it seems like we're going to see more expansion.
More expansion.
Yeah, the demand for bandwidth just keeps growing. With cloud computing streaming services, the Internet of Things, all contributing.
All those devices connecting.
Exactly. More devices, more data, more need for cables.
So more cables, but will the technology itself change?
Oh, definitely. There's some really exciting stuff happening in fiber optics.
Okay, like what?
Researchers are finding ways to transmit data even faster.
Faster cables?
Yeah. They're developing new types of fiber optic cables that can carry way more data than the older ones.
But is there a limit to how much data these cables can handle?
There are physical limits, of course.
Right.
But we're nowhere near them yet.
Okay.
One of the papers you shared talked about something called space division multiplexing.
Space division multiplexing? That sounds complicated.
It's actually pretty clever. They can transmit multiple signals through a single fiber optic strand.
Multiple signals through one strand? How is that even possible?
They use different wavelengths of light.
Okay.
Each wavelength carries a different data stream, and then they combine them into one beam.
So it's like a highway with multiple lanes.
Exactly.
But all inside a single cable.
Right.
That's amazing. It's like they're constantly pushing the limits of what's possible.
Yeah, it's really incredible, the pace of innovation.
But let's shift back to the bigger picture for a moment.
Okay.
The geopolitical side of things.
Uh-huh.
We've talked about digital sovereignty
Right.
and how some countries or companies might have too much control over these cables.
Yeah, that's a big concern.
How do you see that evolving in the future?
Well, it's a question a lot of people are grappling with.
Yeah.
Governments and international organizations are starting to see these cables as more than just commercial assets.
They're seeing them as strategic assets.
Exactly.
Mm.
Vital to national security and economic competitiveness.
So that's changing how countries are approaching this whole issue.
It is. We're seeing governments getting more involved in cable projects.
Okay.
Some are deciding to build their own cables, or they're forming partnerships to make sure they have access.
So they want more control, more self-reliance.
Yeah, you could say that. But there's also this growing understanding that countries need to cooperate.
Right, because no one can do this alone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to work together to set standards, ensure security, and prevent the internet from fracturing.
That makes sense. But what about those big tech companies?
The hyperscalers.
Right. What role will they play?
Well, they're in a good position. They have the resources and the know-how to invest in these projects.
Yeah.
But we might see things shift a bit.
In what way?
As governments start to regulate this more closely,
Okay.
we could see more partnerships between governments and those companies.
Public-private partnerships.
Exactly. Where governments have a say in setting the rules.
To make sure everyone's interests are protected.
Right.
So the future of these cables is a bit uncertain.
It is. There's so many factors at play.
Technology, geopolitics.
The need for global cooperation.
It's going to be really interesting to see how it all unfolds.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic field.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure, those cables are going to remain crucial. They're how we connect with each other.
Right.
And access all the information that's out there.
That vast ocean of data we call the internet.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
I think so.
We've gone from the nuts and bolts of fiber optics
Right.
to the geopolitical implications of digital sovereignty.
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating conversation.
It has. A real eye-opener into a world that most of us don't even think about.
Right, out of sight, out of mind.
But so important to our everyday lives.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed exploring the world of submarine cables.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Those hidden highways of the internet.
The veins and arteries of the digital world.
Exactly. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.